History by John Burnside is a fascinating but very long poem, so I'll tackle this in two halves. So this is part one of an analysis of History by John Burnside. It is one of those poems that is so complex in its imagery and its thought process that it's open to wide interpretation. So please don't think that anything I say about the poem is the only thing that you can say about it. There are a number of ways you can interpret parts of this poem. The only thing I would say to be careful of specifically, especially if you're looking for different analyses on the internet, is that Burnside revised the layout of this poem specifically for the Poems of the Decade anthology. So you may find other copies of the poem that are laid out in a different way, and I would advise you to stick to the way it's laid out here in the book. And also you find some quite strange ideas, I think, about how the poem is meant to resemble the Twin Towers in 9/11, which I don't really think has much weight or relevance. Now you can see here from the date that Burnside gives us to the poem that it is immediately after the atrocities in America in September 11. And that is relevant to the poem, but the poem is not particularly about September the 11th. And it's set in St Andrews in Scotland, and that is near a very famous golf course, if you're familiar with that, and it's also near this RAF base, which he mentions in the poem. And while he is on the beach with his little boy Lucas, they are noticing immediately after September the 11th the increased activity from that RAF base of planes coming and going, precipitated by 9/11. Now, as I said, that acts as a catalyst, I think, for some of the thinking in the poem, but it's not about that event specifically. Now, the poem is written in a real combination of verse styles, but all the way through you've got an iambic beat. So you've got pairs of syllables where the second syllable is stressed. And that gives, firstly, a sense that the poet is talking to you. Iambic beats like that really represent kind of natural human speech. But they represent speech when we're excited or when we're trying to speak really meaningfully. So you can see that this is a poem in which is full of emotion. The poet's really trying to express quite strong feelings to the reader while he kind of muses. And he moves between different poetic forms. At times it appears to be more like free verse, but then there are examples like here where he's writing in iambic pentameter. And further down the poem, when we get there, we'll see that he moves into tetrameter. So the pace of the poem speeds up as the lines get shorter as he moves through the poem. Again, I think partly as he kind of warms to his topic, and also this sense of time passing, of history being made. It's quite hard until you really think about it to see why the poem is called History, because it's very much set in the present moment. But what he's doing is he's thinking about how what we are doing right now in the present is actually creating a future history, if that makes sense. And how what we're doing right now in the time and place we are is underpinning things, or being underpinned by things that are happening elsewhere in the world. So he's on the beach with his little boy, but somewhere else in the world these terrible atrocities and their aftermath are taking place. And that combination of pentameter and tetrameter, we might describe that as breaking lines. And you can see here as well as breaking between different forms. Sorry, let me just move that over. As well as breaking between different forms, he literally breaks lines in terms of the layout. Those breaking lines represent the moving between what he is doing right now and what's going on elsewhere in the world. And our minds often work like that, don't we? We're in a present moment, but we know that there are bigger events going on elsewhere that are going to have an impact on us. Okay, So let's have a look as we go through the poem. So notice that the beginning of sections often start with a kind of temporal discourse marker, today and at times, and then a little bit further down the poem we'll see sometimes. So Burnside is very keen to kind of mark out the time scale of this poem, and that's significant because he starts us in the present moment. And we have a sense that he's really taking in his surroundings. So that handwriting's terrible, that should say moment. There. As we flew the kite, sand spinning off in ribbons, a gasoline smell, things were quail grey. So it's a very sensory description of the beach that he is on. You know, we've got things that he can see, things that he can feel, snail shells, shreds of razorfish, things that he can hear, you know, with the planes. And then we've got little things like metaphor here, quail grey. Now, a quail is a bird, a notoriously kind of placid and gentle bird. So there's a real combination here between kind of activity and stillness, people jogging or stopping to watch, activity and stillness. So you've got a sense of duality, haven't you, of some things being very still and in the now, and other things moving around you. And he's taking this moment, and he gives us another temporal discourse marker here. Today, with the news in my mind and the muffled dread of what may come, I knelt down in the sand with Lucas, gathering shells and pebbles. And this split line form here, I think, really mirrors the fact that on the one hand, he's in the present moment with his little boy picking up shells, but on the other, he knows that there's something terrible going on elsewhere in the world. And as he goes down to describe what he's picking up, you know, with his little boy in the beach, you've got a terrible kind of mirror of what's happening in 9/11, because they're finding snail shells, shreds of razorfish, smudges of weed and flesh on tide-worn stone. So on the one hand, you've got a literal description of what they're finding on the beach, but you've also got a figurative description in his mind. He's imagining what they're finding, you know, in the wreckage of the Twin Towers, the shreds of flesh that might be being found there. And then he moves on to this section here, which is in pentameter, so the verse becomes more formal. It's like he's moving into a more oratory, you know, kind of public speaking moment of the poem. At times I think what makes us who we are is neither kinship nor our given states, but something lost between the world we own and what we dream about behind the names on days like these. So you can see there by me having to flip the paper, you've got a really long kind of enjambed, sorry, I'll move this around, I know it's a bit confusing, section there, which shows him really thinking hard about how he's musing on human nature through the experience that he's having on the beach, and how that links to what's going on elsewhere in the world. And he's really thinking here about something called liminal space, being in a liminal space. And much of the poem deals with this, so I'll just explain that. Now, a liminal space is a place of transition, rather like a doorway. And it's when we are moving between one place or one state and another. And he's very conscious that he is on a beach, but elsewhere the world is really, really changing, and that might make his or his little boy's world change. And I think he really picks up on that idea by actually using the word state here. He's making you think that nothing for human beings is permanent. We change state all of the time. And he uses the metaphor of a kite to really, really bring this home here. Our bodies are fixed and anchored to the shore, so part of us is fixed, but in other ways we're flying high in the same way that a kite would do, moving, our lines raised in the wind. So we are both fixed and moving all the time. We are in the present, but we are creating a future which will later become history. So he's thinking about how time has an impact on people. And though we are confined by property, what tethers us to gravity and light has most to do with distance and the shapes we find in water, reading from a book of Silt and Tides. Now, again, we've got this sense of movement and things changing. Silt is what's left behind when the tide goes out. So he's, again, thinking about as events wash over us, what is left behind is what matters. You know, we're left behind with things having had an impact on us, aren't we? And everything there is talks about shift, patterns of light and things that change. And he gives us these descriptions at the end of a petrol blue jellyfish, a sea anemone combining with a child's first nakedness. And there's lots of things here that are in combination. So he's talking about how one thing might remind you of another thing. So this idea of shifting states. And looking at a sea anemone reminded me of a tiny baby and its little fingers and how they drift, I think. But they're all images to do with fragility, which links with the idea that we are shifting in state all of the time, aren't we? Things are always changing and we can't stay strong and stay the same. And here in this stanza, he's really talking about things that are intangible, things that you can't always touch, and things that are illusory, that change as time goes on. So jellyfish are constantly moving, aren't they? And silt and tides are constantly moving, and light is constantly moving. And when you look at water, you might perceive a shape made by it, and then a second later it's changed because the water has moved. So the shift of state is what makes history, and I think that's where the title of the poem becomes relevant. He's talking about how everything changes, everything's in a constant state of transience, and we are constantly creating what will become history. Nothing stays the same. I'll end this part now and start a new video for part 2.